In the first chapter of their book, Philosophy Through Video Games, John Cogburn and Mark Silcox address the problem of personal identity through the use of MMORPGs and other virtual communities. So the problem of personal identity is as follows. Consider the following uses of the personal pronoun I. I fell in love today, and sir, I have finished loading the cargo into the cutter. Prepare for quantum travel. So according to Cogburn and Silcox, our ability to use these sorts, and this is a quote, our ability to use these sorts of expressions meaningfully seems to presuppose knowledge of a clear criterion of identity, a reliable way, that is, of telling, one, when something still counts as the same object or person after having undergone changes over a period of time, and two, what makes two different things or people different from one another. This is more than a question of whether the two uses of I are asynchronous. On the one hand, we might think that while one use of the pronoun I is controversial, since I would likely never be in the position to load cargo into a space traveling vessel, the other use is uncontroversial since it references the real world and things that I am likely to do. However, consider some additional uses of the personal first pronoun I that I think complicates this assessment, this initial early assessment. I can't believe that I would have been so stupid. Here, there seems to be two dissimilar I's. The first expresses dismay over something that the other previously thought or did. The concern here is that the passage of time has rendered the I into two distinct and separate persons. Therefore, there arises a question regarding the accuracy of self-ascribing the second I. It seems like it should be wrong to self-ascribe actions referencing the past. So, once again, Cogburn and Silcox quote, how can we make sense of the superficially paradoxical fact that an object can undergo changes over a period of time while remaining in some metaphysically significant way exactly the same thing? So they adopt this problem to game dev in the context that in the fact that in such context, it seems false to self-ascribe some action performed in the context of the game in the same way that it seems false to self-ascribe some or to prescribe a sense of identity in the context outside of the game based on like a past performance or behavior or something. So Cogburn and Silcox are going to argue that understanding our roles in role-playing games such as MMORPGs and RPGs and other virtual communities will show us that the temporal and spatial boundaries, quote, the temporal and spatial boundaries of the self are fundamentally vague and therefore, unquote. And so therefore, the proposition then is to acknowledge three distinct uses of the first person pronoun. So there's the first use, and they call it true first person, where the use of the first person pronoun is true in the real world. And then the second, we're going to call ambiguous, where the ascription of the first personal pronoun true is, or I, is true in a game, but it's going to be false in reality. And then the third, they're just going to call a vague ascription. And so here, like one example is uncharacteristic honesty in a novel environment. So for instance, imagine someone who tells a coworker a secret they have previously kept from that person, tells a coworker a secret during a team building seminar that they previously kept from that individual. So when we talk about these other selves, there are, so the other two selves, the ones that are not true in the real world, we're going to call these fictional selves. And so one way to think about these selves is that any self that is not the self defined in a given moment can be a potential self, fictional self. And so this would include selves that are hypothetical. For instance, if I went to the store, I would be late for dinner. These also include past selves. I can't believe I used to think that way, so on and so forth. And so when we talk about fictional selves, we're talking about like the kind of selves that we are in a given game environment or a virtual environment, or whether it's digital or not digital. And so there are a number of games that are going to reveal important questions about the nature of the self, and these are going to include simulators such as The Sims or Microsoft Flight Simulator and Second Life. But there are also MMORPGs such as World of Warcraft, Elder Scrolls, and Final Fantasy, which I think are going to make these questions about personal identity even more interesting. So what is important about these games? One is that they depend on representations of self as but there's a question about who defines the self. So in games like Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop RPGs like Monopoly, the game master or the other players are going to be the ones who define the self. So for instance, if a player cheats in a given game, or if they don't faithfully portray a given character, either the game masters in the case of Dungeons and Dragons or the other players in the case of Monopoly are going to call them out on it. So they're going to police their police their actions of self in this case. But in other games such as MMORPGs, the computer programmer, the computer developer, the software developer, someone like that, they're going to be the ones and so there's a question of like whether they are going to define the self and what aspect of the self or identity are they in charge of defining. So one role that computer programmers have, for instance, in the case of MMOs and MMORPGs, is to partially create a player's character. And as such, the identity represented in the game belongs as much, if not more, to the developer as it does to the player. But there are two important conflicts here. So first, one is a conflict that I think needs to be addressed, and this conflict is a question about whether some game genres allow for more authentic expressions of self than others. And this question largely derives from a particular approach that Cogburn and Silcox offer. So in an RPG or an MMORPG such as World of Warcraft, the player is invited to act out a given character. They are given a role and the tools to enact out that role. And these tools include things like props such as shapes and armor and weapons and clothing, shoes, whatever. Maybe wood to build a fire, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a digital world or if it's an actual one, because when we look at games like Dungeons and Dragons, the game master can also give out props. For instance, 3-inch figurines or something like that. So now, a second important point, and this is a point that is made by Cogburn and Silcox, in some versions of RPGs, for instance, Monopoly and Dungeons and Dragons, a player is rewarded or penalized based on how convincingly they are able to adhere to the alternative self-representation that's prescribed to them. So in the case of Monopoly, if a player does not faithfully portray his character and go to jail when he's supposed to, then the other players of the game are going to police his behavior. They're going to call him out. They're going to sanction him in some way. But in Dungeons and Dragons also, here the game master can judge whether or not a given player is faithfully portraying a given character. And this could be a matter of ability. For instance, an actor will probably be much better at convincing the game master that they're faithfully portraying a given character. So here, I don't know that, but importantly, and this is, once again, this is my own question with this approach, is whether these cases express what is interesting about personal identity. Part of the problem is if I'm being judged on how well or how accurately I faithfully represent a different character, then that seems to me that I am being called or asked to suppress my own identity and adopt this alternative one. I have to put my identity aside. So, for instance, if I am a poor actor, naturally, well, then in order to achieve the aims of the game, I have to ignore the fact that I'm a bad actor and try and be a really good actor, for instance. But Cogburn and Silcox, they're going to offer a different approach. And what they're going to say, so for me, it seems constraining to say that I need to perform the role given to me by a game master or something like that. But Cogburn and Silcox are going to say otherwise. They're going to say that actually being given a role, in the case, such as in the case of an RPG, is going to be more liberating than the MMORPG. And here's their reasoning. I quote, "To achieve these goals, all the player can do is to have her character attempt the various tasks that the game actually puts before her, such as crawling through a cave or fighting off trolls, and then wait while the computer crunches numbers to find out if she succeeds or fails. This can often be a lot of fun, but it is also something quite different than actually pretending to be another person." So it is not clear whether this ambiguity, end quote, sorry. It is not clear whether this ambiguity is central to the main claim, but there are important distinction between tabletop RPGs and MMORPGs is based on the fact that in the one case, the player is judged based on her ability to convincingly perform the role of the character prescribed to her, while in the other, they just need to perform tasks that are associated with a given character. And so the conflict arises when we think that performing tasks is not synonymous with enacting a given identity. So we don't think that our identity is comprised of the tasks that we perform, I guess. So the conflict arises when, let's consider phrases such as, "I charm the shopkeeper." In the context of Dungeons and Dragons, for me to say "I charm the shopkeeper," I have to convincingly portray the character as someone who is charming. But if I am naturally not gifted at charming others, then it would be really hard for me to play this role, to perform this role, and to convince others that I am charming, which is what I would need to do in order to faithfully pursue the aims of the game. So they're not in reference to what we do, right? So this question about identity, as Cogburn and Silcox point out, is not in reference to what we do, but rather it's in reference to what a character who's given to us would do, and whether or not we are able to faithfully suppress our identity in a convincing manner, right? So therefore, the use of the first person pronoun here, I guess we both agree, so Cogburn and Silcox agree, we both agree that the first person use of the first person pronoun here does seem misleading. So it seems misleading in the case that I charm the shopkeeper. I'm not really charming the shopkeeper, it's my character who's charming the shopkeeper. But okay, so like, what's one way to address this issue? So one way to address the issue is through what a naive fictionalist what they would say, and they would just basically deny the truth value of the claim, "I charm the shopkeeper," and they're going to say I am expressing a falsehood, or that it's false that I charm the shopkeeper, or something like that. But what Cogburn and Silcox point out is that in the context of Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, the game developer, or the game master is assigning the truth value. It's not me, it's the game master. So, but like, let's think of another claim in the context of an MMO or an MMORPG. So there are two things here. So in an MMORPG, the truth value is supposed to be adjudicated by my ability to perform certain tasks, but as we've pointed out, that performing tasks is not synonymous with one's identity, right? So what is synonymous with performing one's identity? Well, that's still up for debate. On one hand, it might be that if I'm a charming person who's playing Dungeons and Dragons and my character is charming, then it's less misleading to say that I charm the shopkeeper, because I'm a very charming individual and seems more likely to ascribe charm to not only my character but my identity. But consider the following claim that we might find in an MMO, such as Star Citizen. "Sir, I have finished loading the cutter." Now, what's important here is that when we think about such claims, these claims are not often made in the context of the game, but they're made between players who are operating inside and outside the context of the game. So, for instance, we can imagine if I belong to a particular organization in Star Citizen, and my organization is very much cares about the immersion of Star Citizen, and so we perform watches, which means that 24/7 we have to have one or two individuals manning a particular ship or something like that in the game. And so one of the things that we do upon the change of watch is we debrief one another. So for instance, if player A is ending his shift at 3 p.m. Central and player B is set to take over watch for that individual, then they would say, "Sir, I have finished loading the cutter. All you need to do is fly it to New Babbage," or something like that. In that case, it doesn't seem like it's false because, once again, we're making it outside the context of the game in reference to what's happening in the game or what has happened in the game. And so so when we say that something is false, they're going to say, right, like Cogburn and Silcox are going to say that to just flat out say that the use of the pronoun in the first case, "I charm the shopkeeper," is false, is an unsophisticated attempt to solve the puzzle, and it fails. And they're going to look at an example like, "Sir, I have finished loading the cutter," where I'm talking to someone in or outside the context of the game about the game, and I'm referring to something that's actual. So it seems to be that there is a truth value there. So claims expressing what we do as players in a given virtual environment, if said in a real world context, would be true. And it can be said in a real world context. For instance, if I'm relating to someone what happened to me in the game, and I'm giving them actionable advice about what happens in the game. And so it seems that there is a truth value. There can be a truth value here. So there maybe are some additional emerging classes of game beyond the RPG MMO RPG distinction, for instance MMOs or simulators, that better blur the lines between fictional and actual selves, because that's, I think, what we're looking for, right? And so the above assessment ignores the fact that some games, namely space sims, place more of the onus on the player to create their character through their gameplay. And so, for instance, if I buy a bunch of fighter ships in Star Citizen, well, then my ability to transport cargo is constricted. It's constrained. And it's constrained because of actions that I did, which seems to be a greater marker of identity. Namely, through my gameplay, I am creating my character. So what makes the assertions like the above, "Sir, I have finished loading the cutter," are not things that the game developer defines for us, but rather things that we do in the game. So instead of defining a given character, it seems that what the developer does is provide props for the player to use, and this would be very similar to like what a daycare center does in providing toys to children and leaving it up to the children to decide how to play with those toys. And so when we look at things like space simulators or MMOs or space MMOs or space simulators or whatever, games like EVE Online, Elite Dangerous, and Star Citizen, while some might look at these games as combinations of MMO and RPGs, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, because even though they can involve role-playing elements, the player is much more in charge of those role-playing elements. And so therefore, maybe terms like space simulator or MMO, even though like are probably more conceptually difficult from a marketing standpoint, they better reflect what we want in a virtual realm, which is expressing our true authentic selves. And so like when we look at these new classes of games, they're games where the developer are just giving us the tools to better express who we are and express ourselves.